I want to take a minute and pray before we get into the word tonight. Jesus, thank you that we get to celebrate this evening. That we get to celebrate good and incredible and fantastic news this evening. The fact that you rose from the dead. God, I pray tonight as we open up the word, as we look at some of the stories around what happened and the situations, God, that you would speak to us. God, that you would challenge our thinking. Father, that my words would not be the words that are heard tonight, but that you speaking to us through the scriptures would penetrate and people would hear what it is you have to say. Amen. All right. So this is actually the last week in our Certifiably Legit series. Say legit tonight. Legit. It's legit. I think Jesus rising from the dead is pretty legit. And what I want to actually start off by talking about is I want to ask you about experiences. Have you ever had an experience, something that's happened to you when you look back, you're like, that was a moment that defined me. That was a moment that changed me. That was a moment that shaped me. I got a story about a moment that shaped me, about my cat. About my cat. I know you're like, is my pastor a crazy cat person? The answer is, unfortunately, now, yes. I'm just being honest tonight. So I used to be like really anti-cat. I was not a cat person. And my wife prevailed on me to purchase a kitty cat after about 5 years. So I bought this cat for Laura's birthday a couple years ago, and I fell in love with little Sammy. Samson, the little tabby cat. He is amazing. And I'm kind of like hanging out with Samson one day, you know, as you do with your cat. And he's sitting on the landing looking at me like, you know, like that, like just picture like little tiny kitty cat, like I am the cutest thing in the world. I don't care how like stern and hard-hearted you think you are. I'm telling you, this will melt your heart. And I'm looking at Samson and I start to cry. Stories of honesty tonight. So I'm crying and I'm like, I was wrong. I was wrong all along. Cats are beautiful. Cats are the most incredible thing in the world. And this is a true story. I'm not even exaggerating. I'm sitting there on the landing crying. And like a man, you know. And I had this experience where I realized that my attitude towards animals was actually wrong. Like, I kind of viewed them as like, you know, irrelevant and unable to bring joy into the world. And I had this moment where I realized that actually Samson was part of God's creation and he could bring me joy. And my attitude on cats was forever changed. Now I'm a crazy cat person. I was just in Ottawa this past week and apparently there's a cafe called Cat Cafe, but cats run free inside the cafe and they have like climbing gyms. It's like get your latte and your cat pet on. It's just incredible. It was an experience for me. It was a moment that I will remember for a long time. I know you think I'm crazy now. Everything I say from this point on, you're like, I can't trust this guy. But it was a moment that was a kind of a significant moment for me. And I'm sure if I was to ask you tonight, have you had a moment in your life that was significant, you could probably recall one. Just take a minute and think of a moment in your life that's significant. Maybe it was the first time you got in a fight in elementary school. You're like, I've never been in a fight. Good on you. Maybe it was your first kiss. Maybe you're like, oh, that's awkward. Maybe it was the first time you failed something. Maybe it was the first time you succeeded at something. Maybe it was the first time you publicly spoke and didn't puke. Maybe, I don't know what those moments are in your life that were significant, but in our story, in our text tonight, there is a serious moment that is about to go down. So what I want to do is I want to read for you out of John chapter 16. Now, to set the tone for this is basically the night before Jesus is going to be crucified. And he's sitting down with his disciples and having a moment. He's having a moment with them, a moment where he's telling them some things that are hard for them to hear. They don't know how to process it. They're confused. And he's trying to help them understand what's about to happen in his death and subsequent resurrection, although they're not getting the picture. So check it out, John chapter 16. I'm going to start reading in verse 16. This is Jesus speaking. In a little while you won't see me anymore, but a little while after that you will see me again. Some of the disciples asked each other, What does he mean when he says, in a little while you won't see me, but then you will see me, and I am going to be with the Father? And what does it mean in a little while? We don't understand. Jesus realized they wanted to ask him about it, so he said, are you asking yourselves what I mean? When I said in a little while you won't see me, but a little while after that you will see me again. Here's the thing, here's the certifiably legit statement. I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn over what is going to happen to me, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will suddenly turn to wonderful joy. It will be like a woman suffering the pains of labor. When her child is born, her anguish gives way to joy because she has brought a new baby into the world. So you have sorrow now, but I will see you again. Then you will rejoice, and no one can rob you of that joy. At that time, you won't need to ask me for anything. I tell you the truth, you will ask the Father directly, and he will grant your request, because you use my name. You haven't done this before. Ask using my name, and you will receive, and you will have abundant joy. I have spoken in these matters in figures of speech, but soon I will stop speaking figuratively and will tell you plainly all about the Father. Then you will ask in my name. I am not saying I will ask the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you dearly because you love me and believe that I came from God. Yes, I came from the Father into the world, and now I will leave the world and return to the Father. Then the disciples said, at last you are speaking plainly and not figuratively. Now we understand that you know everything, and there's no need to question you. From this we believe that you are from God. And Jesus asked, do you finally believe? Now this is an interesting text. This is an interesting text because Jesus is predicting things, and the disciples are kind of getting it. They're going, I don't really understand the picture you're painting Jesus. I'm not really quite catching what you're saying. You're saying something's going to happen, but then there's going to be joy, and then there's going to be suffering, and then there's going to be more joy, and I'm not understanding. And it's easy to read this and be like, I don't get what's going on. This seems sort of like this back and this forth. Now, fortunately, when we read this, we can kind of look back and we know the outcome of the story. So we have some foresight reading here, knowing that Jesus is talking about the fact that he is going to go and suffer the most brutal, murderous death he could possibly suffer. He's about to go suffer and die. But then he's also predicting that even though he dies, he will rise again, that they will not see him, predicting his death, and then they will see him again, predicting his resurrection. Now what he's saying here is, guys, disciples, people, you're about to go through an experience. You're about to have a moment that is going to shape you forever. What's about to happen is going to change you. It's going to change how you see things. It's going to change what you value. It's going to change you. You see what he says in verse 22, so you have sorrow now, but I will see you again. Then you will rejoice. So in other words, there's going to be something that's going to happen that's going to cause you great sorrow, great pain, great confusion, great grief. Something's going to happen, but after, something magnificent is going to happen. Something so magnificent is going to happen that you will rejoice. Your response to this event is going to be rejoicing. In fact, it's going to be rejoicing so much so that nobody can take it from you. Nobody can take this joy that's going to come from you. It's interesting. These disciples, these people he was talking to, the next day desert Jesus. They abandon him. Jesus is arrested by the Roman legion, and they take him off to try him. And the followers of Jesus, they split like a bomb was dropped. Boom, gone. And they run in fear for their lives because all of a sudden their leader has been arrested and is on trial for treason. And it's fascinating, these men, they're shaking in their boots, they're afraid, they're fearful. But then something happens. Jesus' prediction that something would happen that would turn their sorrow and grief and confusion into joy. Something happens. In fact, something so significant happens that every single one of the men, bar one that Jesus is talking to, end up dying. They end up dying because they follow him. They end up dying because they believe something has happened here that is worth giving our lives for. So there's a transformation at the beginning of the story. In the moment of grief, in the moment of confusion, they're lost, they're afraid, they're confused. But then something happens. Something happens that converts these men and women of fear and confusion into a people that would turn around and give their lives. They would give their lives for this man. It's interesting, these guys would be hated. They would be rejected. They would be cursed. They would be crucified, some of them. They would be beaten and stoned. They would be driven out of cities. They would be poor. They would be shipwrecked. And yet they write this in Acts chapter 5. They beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus. And they let them go. Then they left the presence of the council. This is talking about Peter. They left the presence of the council after being beaten and told not to speak of Jesus. And what did they do? They rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. They rejoiced at the suffering that they endured. So their response to the greatest suffering and punishment, their response when faced with very death, was joy. Jesus' words here were not idle when he says, you have grief now, you're confused now, but you're going to have joy, and no one can take it away. He was right. These people, they had a joy that nobody could take away. So the question is, what happened? What happened to these people that were afraid? These men that ran in all directions, that quivered in fear? What happened to these men that caused them to give their lives for something? What happened? The answer to the question is the very center of the Christian faith. The answer to the question of what happened to these men is the very center of what we believe. It's the very center, the central point, the hinge on which everything else rests. It is the hinge of the resurrection of Jesus. See, now this is interesting. See, the Christian faith is not built upon a set of creeds. It's not built upon a set of even beliefs. It's not built upon a set of actions or a set of rituals. It is built upon one thing and one thing only. Did Jesus die and rise from the dead? In other words, the Christian faith is not built upon what you believe, it's built upon what happened. It's built upon an event in history, an event that is empirically verifiable or falsifiable, an event that is testable. We can go and look and say, did Jesus exist? Was he a man? Did he actually live and walk on this earth? Did he actually die? Did he actually rise from the dead? Because if he didn't, then none of this matters at all. And these men gave their lives for nothing. So the question of the resurrection is not just a question of belief, it is a question that is foundational to the very course of human history, the very fabric of your life. It is not just an anecdotal question, it is a foundational question. Now, I can't get into it all tonight, the questions of, well, can we know if Jesus died? Can we know if he was resurrected? But I want to give you a few hints, a few clues, because it is a history event. We can go and study it. And if you study historians from the time of Jesus and after, you will find that virtually every single person, every single major historian alive today and down the histories affirms that Jesus was a real man. More than that, more than affirming that he was a real man, they affirm that he was actually crucified by the Romans. Now, let's just pause for a second. What I'm saying here is that that Jesus, the question of did he or did he not die on the cross is not really a question of belief, it's a question of history. And when we look at history, we find that historians across the ages and across the world affirm that yes, Jesus was a real man. And yes, he did really die on the cross. Now people say, no, he didn't really die. That's a difficult question to throw out because the Romans beat him to within an inch of his life and then professionally executed him. These weren't a bunch of amateurs that were like, we're going to knock off this guy. These were professional executioners whose job it was to make sure that Jesus died and stayed dead. Now, following his death, they put his body in a grave, in a tomb. Again, a fact that we can verify from history. Now, following this putting the body in the tomb, there were guards put at the entrance to the tomb. Now, these guards were significantly incentivized to make sure that that body stayed in that tomb. It was imperative that the body stays in the tomb. Because if there was going to be any kind of claim to a sort of a resurrection or arrival or a restoration of Jesus, they would just have to produce the body. Say, look, there's no body. Or here's the body of the man we killed. Jesus is dead. He's buried. But the problem is that there was no body. That when the early Christians started to testify that Jesus is risen, that he is risen from the dead, all the authorities and the leaders would have to do is present a body. All they would have to do is say, hey, here's Jesus. Here's the body. You're a bunch of liars. But they couldn't because there was no body. You see, so for the early Christians to propose that, hey, Jesus actually rose from the dead is not just a nice belief. It's actually a question of history. And the problem historically is that the evidence seems to suggest that the early Christians certainly believed that he rose from the dead, and there's no evidence to suggest that he didn't. Now, we can devolve into all kinds of questions around what we believe. Around what the Bible says, around this or that, around what morality is, around who God is and what he's like. But at the end of the day, the only question that really matters, the only question that we can really build upon firmly is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Now, that was just a very brief sketch of the evidence. This is not an apologetics class tonight. I'm going to encourage you to go study it yourself. But check out what the historian N.T. Wright has to say. The only explanation for their behavior, the early Christians, their stories, their symbols, and their theology, is that they really believed Jesus had been bodily raised from the dead. This conclusion is so well grounded that today, modern times, even those who would like to insist that the body of Jesus in fact remained decomposing in the tomb agree that the early Christians believed him to have been bodily raised, leaving an empty tomb behind him. So now here's the thing, and I think this is maybe one of the most compelling pieces for me and my faith, is that the men and the women that held these early beliefs held them so sincerely that they died for them. They didn't just believe that Jesus had risen from the dead as an idea. They believed it so intensely and so profoundly across time and across places and across decades that they were willing to die from it. In fact, not one of the men in the room that Jesus was talking to that made it to the resurrection, not one of them recanted. Not one of them who claimed that Jesus was resurrected ever said, no, I was wrong. Now think about that for a second. You have a whole pile of people across different times, across different places, that sincerely believed something enough to die for it. You see, they didn't just believe something. They didn't just adopt a set of beliefs. They died for what they saw happen. And there was a world of difference. Furthermore, if you go on and investigate early Christianity, you'll find that there was great coherence across the belief systems. It wasn't like there was this fragmented belief around what Jesus did or didn't do. Universally, Christians believed from day one that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. Now, I find this interesting. Many of us are tonight and in our lives struggling to find something to live for. We wake up and we go about our days and we're going, why am I here? Why does it matter? Does my life matter? Do I have anything to bring to the world? And yet here, these people that Jesus interacted with didn't just find something to live for. They found something to die for. That matters. That matters. You see, the death and resurrection of Jesus is not just a belief. It was a transformational experience that radically changed the people that experienced it. See, as I said, this is the hinge on which everything rests. Did Jesus or did Jesus not rise from the dead? And I encourage you, if you've never sincerely examined the evidence, to go and read about it, to go and study it, to go and ask yourself, who is Jesus? Did he live or did he die? Now tonight, this experience was not just an experience that transformed them. He goes on to, in other words, it didn't just lead them to joy. He goes on to say that they would be able to start doing something that they had never done before. He says first that you're going to have a joy in verse 22, but then in verse 23 he says this, at that time you won't need to ask me for anything. I tell you the truth, you will ask the Father directly and he will grant your request because you use my name. You haven't done this before. Ask using my name and you will receive at that time. So in other words, Jesus is about to go and die and rise from the dead. And what he's saying here is, after I am done with my job, you will be enabled to do something that you have never been enabled to do before at that time. In other words, Jesus sets out to go and accomplish something. To go and accomplish something in the people that were listening to him. The something wasn't just that they would have joy, it was to enable them to do something. And what was the thing that they could do? The thing that they could do was to enter into direct and accessible relationship with the creator of the universe, with him who knit them together. Now, the important thing to understand here is that this ability to step into relationship with God was not predicated or built upon anything that they did. It was built upon what he did. What Jesus is saying here is, I'm going to go do something. I'm going to go die and rise from the dead. And as a result of that, you will be able to step into relationship with God. Now, maybe you're here tonight and you're going, I don't know if I even believe in God. I'm kind of curious about the stuff about Jesus' evidence, but I'm not sure what I believe. I want to challenge you. If what Jesus is saying is true, if what he is saying that we can actually step into relationship with God, if that is actually true tonight, it changes everything. It changes your decision making. It changes your relationships. It changes your view of money, your view of sexuality, your view of your job, your view of your family, your view of the person sitting next to you. Everything changes if what Jesus is saying is true. And for the people listening to Jesus, this would have been completely and utterly radical. To hear that we would be able to directly come to God and ask him something. To be in relationship, to know him. Like, that sounds radical. This conversation was happening in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there was a temple. And in that temple, people would sacrifice things. In fact, many of the men and women that Jesus was talking to would have been a part of the rituals in that temple. And they would sacrifice things to try and be in relationship with God. So the idea that you could be in relationship with God apart from the sacrificial system would have been radical. He goes on to say, if you pray in my name. Now, we look at this and go, what is Jesus talking about here? If I say the right incantation, I'm going to be able to be in relationship with God. I was doing some digging, and I think actually this is a bit of a commentary on Roman culture at the time. You see, the Romans believed, the kingdom that was ruling over the area, believed that in order to pray to God, you had to get the ritual just right. In order to be in relationship with God, in order to have God answer your prayers, you had to say the God's name just right. You get it wrong, boom, no prayer. You had to go through the ritual, and if you mess the ritual up, You would have to go back to the beginning and start again. And so what Jesus is saying here is because of the work I'm going to do, you can be in relationship with God directly. So when he says in my name, he's not saying it is some sort of mechanical, do this and you can have a relationship with God. What he's saying is because of the work I am going to do, you can have access to the Father. But you know what the thing is? We don't really like this. I mean, we read it, sounds kind of cool, but we like our lists. We like our checklists of our own morality. We like our checklists of how good we are, how right I have done things. Have I sinned this week? Have I done this or have I done that? And what we try to do is define morality for ourselves and say, I'm good enough to be in relationship with God. I'm good enough to know him. If I just do it right, if I just get the mechanics right this week, I'll be able to pray and God will answer my prayers. And you know what? Maybe God's not answering my prayers because I'm not behaving correctly. Maybe you've got, I don't know what problem you've got. Maybe it's pornography, maybe it's sleeping around, maybe it's drinking too much, maybe you're a gossiper, I don't know. And maybe you keep telling yourself, if I could just stop these, God would answer my prayers. But you know what Jesus is saying tonight? That has nothing to do with it. Your ability to check off the checklist doesn't determine God's ability to answer your prayers. That ability is determined by what Jesus did when he died and rose again. I tell you the truth, you will ask the Father directly and he will grant your request. Why? Because you use my name, because you trust me, because you recognize this isn't about you, this is about what God is doing in you. How much that would have contrasted for the disciples to hear that, wait a second, you tell me I don't have to do sacrifices, I don't have to get the ritual right, I don't have to get the names right, I don't have to get everything just right so that I can be in relationship. This would have blown their minds. But I think if you actually do the work and compare this to every other faith system out in the world, you will find that it is completely and totally unique. See, every other faith system says if you do these rituals, if you pray this many times, if you do this, and this, if you live a good life, if you follow the rules, then you're going to be able to be in relationship with God. And what Jesus says here is that actually your ability to be in relationship with God is nothing to do with you. It is everything to do with me. And this takes humility. This takes a letting go of our way of life, our strengths and our weaknesses. It takes a willingness to say, God, you know what? Actually, you're right. I am weak. I don't know what's going on. I can't defeat this sin on my own. I can't be good on my own. I can't determine what goodness is on my own. In fact, I need you, Jesus. You see, because what Jesus is saying here is the objective isn't for you to live a sinless life. The objective for you is to be in direct relationship with the Father. The objective, the purpose, the goal of Christianity is not about behavior, it's about relationship. And what Jesus is saying here, would you guys stop wrapping your world up in rituals and systems and checklists and this and that, and would you step into direct and honest and beautiful and glorious relationship with him who made you? But so often we define ourselves by what we have done. We define our ability for God to answer our prayers based on what we've done. And Jesus is saying here, at that time, you see, this has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. The resurrection is glorious because it demonstrates to us tonight that the product of trusting God with our life, even a willingness to give up our lives, in fact, is life. This is the upside down logic of Jesus' life, that in him giving his life, he actually rose to new life. And so the call for us is, are we willing to give our lives? Are we willing to trust our lives and say, Jesus, I'm going to trust you knowing that you rose to life and you will raise me to new life. I trust you knowing that you could give me a joy that nobody can take away. So we come to verse 27. I love this verse because it's almost like a bumper sticker. But in the context of the story, it's so profound. It says this, "For the Father himself loves you dearly because you love me and believe that I came from God." For the Father himself loves you dearly. We live in a world that talks a lot about love, don't we? A world that talks a lot about we should just love each other. We should just be nice people. Everybody should just love each other. I have a question tonight. What does that mean? How do we know what love is? How do we know what love is? When we talk about God, when we talk about love, what are we talking about? But you see, here's the thing. We're not left wondering because of what Jesus has done. We're not left wondering, I don't know what love is. I don't know what my standing is. I don't know what my relationship is. I don't know how to love. You see, the glorious truth of what Jesus did is that he demonstrated what love is. See, love looks like Jesus hanging on the cross and saying, I want you. I want you. I want you to be in relationship with me. I want you to know me. I want you to have purpose. I want you to have joy. That's what love is. Love is Jesus giving up his life. See, love is not abstract. Love is not confusing. Love is a name. Love has a face. Love has a story. Love is an experience that Jesus went through on the cross when he said, I love you. Love is not defined by the whims of our emotions or our feelings. It is defined by the concrete experience of him who hung on the cross. When we come to God, we come to a God that understands. Try to comprehend that for a moment. When we talk about God's love here, we're not talking about a love that is abstract or confusing or difficult to understand. We are talking about a love that finds itself in the midst of the cross. I'm just going to get you guys to pause the communion for a sec. Just throw it down on a chair next to you. We'll get it going in just a second. I want you guys to hear this. I don't want you to be distracted. You see, the cross is not just an event. When Jesus says the Father himself loves you, he's not talking in the abstract, he's talking in the specific. The specific event of Jesus dying on that cross. The specific event of God saying, I love you enough to die for you. You might have pain, you might have sorrow, you might have grief, but I actually understand that. I've actually been there, I've been in the midst of it. So Jesus asks his disciples a question. In verse 31, Jesus asked a question of his disciples. And it's a question I want to ask you tonight. And this is a question for you tonight, whether you've come in as a skeptic, whether you've come in as somebody that's walked with Jesus. It's a question I want to ask you because it's a question Jesus asked. The question is simple. Do you finally believe? Do you finally believe? Do you believe Jesus' words about freedom and peace and joy? Do you believe them? Do you believe that when he talks about holiness and repentance and a call to life, that he actually has something to offer? Do you believe him when he talks about your money or your sexuality or your family or your job? You see, Jesus talks to all these things, but do we want to hear? Do we believe him? Do we trust him? Do we know him? Do we believe him when he talks about justice in Matthew chapter 5? Do we believe him that blessed are the poor? That blessed are the persecuted? Do we believe him? You see, the world around us wants to frame all this. But I submit to you tonight that the world around us wants to frame all of those questions with answers that don't produce life. And Jesus is saying, I want to give you joy. I want to give you a joy that nobody can take away. See, this is the power of the resurrection, that he says, I'm going to give up my life that you might have life. And then in doing so, he rises to new life. See, the question of the historical fact is only the first step. We can believe that even Jesus rose from the dead. We can assent to that intellectually. But do we believe him when he says, I want to give you a joy that nobody can take away, but you have to trust me? You see, your future purpose and your past guilt, the thing you were made for and the things you were done, they both find themselves at the cross. They both find a challenge at the cross where Jesus says, yeah, you've messed up. Yeah, you've dropped the ball. Yeah, you've tried to define things. Yeah, you've tried to figure out how to be a good person on your own. But at the cross, we're invited to say, all right, Jesus, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to believe you. I'm going to put faith in you. I'm going to honor you. So Jesus' question is the question I have for you tonight. Do you believe? Do you believe tonight? What we're going to do is we're going to take up communion in just a minute. I'm going to have the band come up. And if you've never taken communion or you don't call yourself a Jesus follower, you can just take this time to think or reflect on what I've said. So while we pass those around, I'm just going to get the band to lead. And then I'll come back up in a second and let you know what to do. So just hang on to the communion for a second.
Unravel me with the melody. You surround me with the song of deliverance.